Power is a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. But sometimes, the moment you think you're untouchable is the moment life teaches you the hardest lesson. Welcome to Life Story. This is the place where real-life stories unfold. If you believe in the power of storytelling, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Share these life stories with your friends and join our growing community. Let's make a difference, one story at a time. Officer Clive was the kind of man who thrived on power. To him, his badge was more than a symbol of duty. It was a weapon, a shield, and a crown. On any given day, he prowled the streets, not to serve and protect, but to remind everyone who held the authority. Clive didn't see people. He saw categories. Teenagers laughing on a corner weren't kids, they were trouble waiting to happen. A hard-working street vendor wasn't a man earning an honest living. He was someone suspicious, someone who didn't belong. And as Clive drove through the city, his words betrayed his beliefs. "You see those kids over there?" he'd say to his partner, Officer Frank. "I bet half of them don't even know what work is, probably just waiting for their next bad decision." Frank often felt uneasy riding alongside Clive. He wasn't a bad cop, but he wasn't brave enough to confront Clive either. Whenever Clive made his snide comments, Frank would shift uncomfortably, mumble something vague, and let the moment pass. Clive took that silence as agreement. He thrived in it. To him, silence meant approval, and approval meant power. As they passed a Middle Eastern food vendor setting up his cart, Clive chuckled to himself. "I wonder what he's really selling. Bet he doesn't have a license for that cart. Should we check, Frank?" Frank didn't answer. He didn't have to. Clive had already made up his mind. Clive's patrol wasn't about solving problems or helping people. It was about control. When a woman on the sidewalk tried to flag him down, hoping for help, he waved her off without even slowing down. "Some people just love to play the victim," he muttered, as if her problem was her own fault. That was Clive. Arrogant, dismissive, and untouchable, or so he thought. Amani was everything Clive wasn't. Where he saw differences, she saw connections. Where he ignored the people around him, she went out of her way to help them. Amani was a small business owner with a big heart. She spent her days running her shop and her evenings giving back to the community. Whether it was feeding the homeless or mentoring kids, she believed in action over words. That morning, she stopped by a busy street corner where a homeless man sat with a cardboard sign. Without hesitation, she handed him a sandwich and a bottle of water. "Stay safe out here," she said warmly, her kindness as natural as breathing. Nearby, a little boy struggled with a heavy bag. Amani noticed immediately and stepped in to help, carrying it to his mother with a smile. She didn't expect thanks or recognition. She did it because it was the right thing to do. But not everyone saw it that way. As Amani walked away, a police car pulled up beside her. Clive leaned out of the window, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What's the plan? Running for sainthood?" Imani turned toward the car. She didn't flinch, and she didn't smile. "Just trying to make the world a better place," she replied evenly. Clive smirked. "Well, don't try too hard. People like you might not stick around long enough to see the change." It wasn't the first time Imani had heard words like that, but she never let them get to her. She stood tall, unshaken, as Clive drove away. Later that day, Clive saw Imani again. This time, she was speaking to a street vendor, exchanging ideas about starting a program for underprivileged youth. She had a knack for turning simple conversations into meaningful action. Clive didn't like what he saw. In his mind, people like Imani didn't belong in his world, a world where power and privilege decided who mattered. As he approached, Imani turned, accidentally bumping into him. "Excuse me," she said politely. But Clive's temper flared. "Excuse you?" he snapped. "Watch where you're going." Imani met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. It was an accident. Clive wasn't satisfied. To him, an apology wasn't enough. It was submission he wanted. "You think you can walk around here like you own the place?" Imani didn't back down. "No one owns these streets, officer. Not you, not me. But I won't let you intimidate me." Clive stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "You'd better watch yourself. You don't know who you're dealing with." Imani held her ground, her eyes steady. "Neither do you." For the first time in a long time, Clive felt a flicker of doubt. He didn't understand why, But something about Amani unsettled him. It was the way she stood, unshaken, like a storm that wouldn't bend to his will. But Clive wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. That moment marked the beginning of something Clive couldn't predict. Amani wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a force that would change everything. The next day, Clive spotted Amani at a bustling cafe near the town square. She was seated outside, surrounded by a small group of community members. Her voice carried a tone of inspiration as she discussed plans for a new youth program. "This program isn't just about helping kids stay off the streets," she said. "It's about giving them hope, showing them they can dream beyond their circumstances." The group listened intently, nodding in agreement. Passers-by paused to hear her words, drawn to her charisma and determination. But Clive, who was on patrol nearby, saw something entirely different. To him, Imani wasn't a community leader. She was a problem that needed to be silenced. Clive approached the cafe, his stride purposeful and his expression smug. "Well, if it isn't the neighborhood savior," he said loudly, drawing attention from the group. "What's the plan today? Handing out halos?" Amani glanced up at him, her face calm but unamused. "Good afternoon, Officer Clive," she replied. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Oh, I don't need help," Clive sneered. "But maybe these folks do. Did you tell them about your qualifications? Or is this just another one of your little publicity stunts?" The group exchanged uneasy glances, but Amani remained unshaken. She folded her hands on the table and addressed him directly. "You're welcome to sit down, officer, and hear what we're trying to accomplish. It might even inspire you." Clive laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Inspire me? You're funny. But let's be real here. People like you are all talk. You think a few words can fix the world? Please." Amani's expression didn't waver. "Words have power, Officer Clive. They can build bridges or burn them, but actions matter too. And what I'm doing here, that's action." The crowd around the cafe began to grow as people stopped to watch the interaction. Clive could feel their eyes on him, and it made his blood boil. He leaned in closer, his voice low but cutting. "Let me give you some advice. Stop pretending you're better than everyone else. You're nothing special, just another loudmouth who doesn't know her place." Amani stood, her voice steady and firm. "My place? My place is standing up to bullies like you. My place is making sure my community has a voice, even if you don't want to hear it. And my place is definitely not bowing to someone who abuses their power." The cafe erupted in murmurs, some people clapping quietly. Clive's face turned red with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in public. And then, it happened. Without thinking, Clive raised his hand and slapped Imani across the face. The sound echoed, silencing the crowd. The slap left a ripple of shock through the air. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the city in the background. Imani didn't fall. She didn't cry out. She stood tall, her head slowly turning back to face Clive, her eyes burning with both pain and defiance. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice calm but powerful. The crowd erupted into chaos. Several people pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Others rushed to check on Imani, their voices rising in anger. "Did you see that?" someone shouted. "He just hit her." Clive froze, his hands still trembling from the strike. For the first time, he realized what he'd done and the consequences that might follow. He tried to bluster his way out of it, turning to the crowd. She was being disrespectful, but no one was listening to him anymore. All eyes were on Imani. She held up her hand to silence the crowd, then her composure returning. "I'm fine," she said firmly, "but this isn't over." Imani pulled out her phone, her fingers steady as she dialed. The line connected, and she spoke with quiet determination. "Everett, it's Imani. I need your help." Everett, her lawyer and longtime friend, was someone who knew Imani's strength and resolve better than anyone. On the other end of the line, his voice was calm but serious. "What happened?" Imani glanced at Clive, who was still standing there, his face a mix of anger and panic. "I was assaulted by a police officer, and I have witnesses." She ended the call and turned to the crowd. "If anyone here recorded what happened, please hold on to that footage. I'll need it." The people nodded, some already offering to send her their videos. The murmurs of support grew louder, drowning out Clive's attempts to regain control of the situation. Imani didn't stop there. She approached one of the cafe staff members. "I'll need the security footage too," she said. "This needs to be documented." The staff member nodded, their expression grim. "You'll have it," they promised. Clive thought his badge made him untouchable, but Imani wasn't the kind of person to let fear silence her. That slap wasn't just an act of violence. It was the spark that would ignite a fire Clive never saw coming. And this time, the whole world was watching. Clive stormed into the precinct that evening, his chest puffed up with false confidence. To him, the slap was nothing more than an assertion of his authority, a reminder of who held the power. He found Frank in the locker room, leaning against a row of lockers with a tired expression. "You should have seen it," Clive said, his tone laced with pride. "She thought she could mouth off to me in front of everyone. Well, I showed her." Frank glanced up, his face clouded with unease. "What do you mean? You showed her?" Clive smirked, leaning in as if sharing a joke. "She got loud, so I shut her up, gave her a little slap to remind her who's in charge." The room fell silent, and for a moment Frank simply stared at him. Then he shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. "Clive, what were you thinking? Do you even realize what you've done?" "What I've done?" Clive scoffed. "I did my job, Frank. People like her need to be reminded of their place." Frank straightened, his tone sharper now. "And what place is that, Clive? Because it sounds like you're digging your own grave." Clive waved him off, refusing to acknowledge the warning. "Relax. She won't do anything. People like her bark a lot, but they never bite." Frank stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't get it, do you? People recorded it. There's video proof of what you did. And if she decides to fight back, you're not just risking your badge, you're risking everything." For the first time, Clive hesitated. He didn't show it, but Frank's words planted a seed of doubt. Still, his pride wouldn't let him admit it. "You're overreacting," he muttered. "This'll blow over." Frank's expression hardened. "You really believe that? You think the world works the same way it did 10 years ago? People aren't silent anymore, Clive. And if you think you can get away with this, you're delusional." Clive bristled but said nothing. As Frank turned to leave, his parting words hung in the air like a warning. "Don't say I didn't warn you." That night, as Clive sat in his car, the silence was deafening. He replayed the day's events in his mind, trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But deep down, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. The next morning, Clive's world began to unravel. The video of the slap had spread like wildfire. It was everywhere, on social media, local news, even national outlets. The footage was crystal clear. Clive's hand striking Imani's face, her calm but defiant response, and the gasps of the crowd. The caption beneath the video read, "Local officer assaults community leader, justice for Imani." Comments flooded in from every corner of the internet. People were outraged, demanding action. "How can someone like this wear a badge?" one comment read. "She stood her ground, and he couldn't handle it," said another. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for Imani was trending. Community leaders, activists, and even celebrities weighed in, condemning Clive's actions and calling for his suspension. At the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Clive walked in, his usual swagger noticeably diminished. Officers whispered as he passed, their glances sharp and judgmental. He tried to ignore them, but the weight of their stares was impossible to escape. In the captain's office, Clive sat stiffly as his superior slammed a printed copy of the story on the desk. The headline glared up at him like an accusation. "Officer assault sparks outrage in city." "Care to explain this?" the captain demanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. Clive shifted uncomfortably. "It's being blown out of proportion," he said defensively. "She was causing a scene and I was—" "You were what?" the captain interrupted, his tone cutting. "Exercising your authority? Do you even realize what you've done to this department? The public is calling for your resignation. There are protests outside the station as we speak." Clive's stomach twisted, but he refused to back down. "I was doing my job," he insisted. "She disrespected me." The captain leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "No, Clive. What you did wasn't your job. It was a disgrace. And if you think this is going away, you're in for a rude awakening." Outside, the protests grew louder. People held signs that read, "End police violence," and "Accountability for Clive." A reporter's voice carried over the noise as she broadcast live. "Community members have gathered here today to demand justice for Imani. the small business owner and activist who was assaulted by Officer Clive during a public altercation. The video of the incident has sparked outrage, with calls for police reform echoing across the city. Inside his patrol car, Clive scrolled through his phone, each notification a reminder of how far the backlash had spread. News articles, social media posts, emails. His name was everywhere, and none of it was good. But even as the walls closed in, Clive clung to his arrogance. "They'll move on," he muttered to himself. "They always do." He couldn't have been more wrong. The slap was more than a moment. It was a symbol, a rallying cry for justice. And while Clive refused to see the storm brewing around him, Imani was already preparing for the next battle. The first few days following the viral incident were a blur for Imani, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about her. It was about justice. It was about a system that had allowed power to be abused for far too long. She wasn't going to let Clive get away with this. Imani's lawyer, Everett, wasted no time in filing a formal complaint with the department and pushing for an internal investigation. The evidence was undeniable: the video, the witnesses, and the growing public outrage. Clive's actions had crossed a line that no one could ignore. As the days wore on, the weight of the situation bore down on Clive. He had expected this to blow over. He had expected his badge to shield him from the consequences. But as he walked into the precinct for his mandatory meeting with his superiors, the reality hit him with full force. Clive sat across from the captain, trying to maintain his composure. His heart raced as the captain placed a thick stack of paperwork in front of him. "You're aware of the complaint filed against you," the captain said coldly, his fingers tapping against the file. "The evidence is overwhelming." Clive crossed his arms, trying to act confident, though the room felt smaller with every passing second. "It's all a misunderstanding," he insisted. "She was being confrontational. I had no choice but to assert control." The captain didn't flinch. "You had no choice? You slapped a civilian, Clive, a woman, in public. Do you understand the ramifications of your actions?" Clive's eyes darted to the other officers in the room, their faces blank, their judgment clear. His partner, Frank, stood silently in the corner, refusing to meet his gaze. "I'm telling you it was justified," Clive repeated, his voice rising with desperation. "She disrespected me first. Before he could finish, the door opened, and Frank stepped forward. "I can't stand by this anymore," Frank said quietly. Clive's stomach dropped. Frank's words were like a knife twisting in his gut. He had never expected Frank to turn against him. "I've seen Clive's behavior up close," Frank continued, his voice steady but full of regret. "The way he's treated people, his racist remarks, his abuse of power. This isn't an isolated incident. I can't cover for him anymore." Clive's face went pale as Frank's testimony filled the room. Frank detailed Clive's history of harassment, the moments he had turned a blind eye to his partner's actions. He spoke of the countless times Clive had belittled people, made degrading comments, and used his badge to intimidate others. "I've tried to ignore it," Frank admitted, "but this time, he crossed a line." Clive's mind raced as the truth set in. He had lost his ally, and now the full force of the investigation was closing in on him. The captain gave him one last look before standing up. "You're suspended pending further investigation. You'll be contacted once the review is complete. Don't leave town." Clive wanted to shout to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. The walls seemed to be closing in around him, and the weight of his own actions crushed him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Imani stood before a packed crowd at the city's largest community center, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had fought for. The walls echoed with applause as she took her place at the podium. The incident with Clive had ignited a fire in the community, and people were coming together in a way that hadn't been seen in years. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Thank you to everyone who has shown up, who has raised their voice in support of justice. What happened to me was wrong, but it's not just about me, it's about all of us." The crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. Imani's story was not just one of confrontation, but of survival, of strength, of standing up when the odds were against her. She shared her experiences, growing up in a neighborhood where violence was common, where respect was something you had to fight for. But the turning point had come years earlier, when her father, an outspoken advocate for racial justice, was killed in a police-related incident. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "My father believed in justice," she said softly. "He fought for it his whole life. And when they took him from us, didn't just take a man, they took a part of me. But I promised him, and I promised myself, that I would make a difference. That I would fight for a world where we don't have to live in fear of those who are supposed to protect us." The crowd erupted in applause, the energy shifting, growing stronger with every word she spoke. "I'm here today to ask you all to stand with me," Imani continued. "Not just for me, but for every person who has been silenced, for every injustice that has gone unnoticed. We are not powerless. We are the change." Her words spread like wildfire, inspiring countless others to take action. Protests organized in her name and petitions for police reform gained momentum. The story of the slap had become a rallying cry, and Imani was at the forefront, leading the charge for justice. As the investigation into Clive's actions continued, more witnesses came forward, each one willing to testify to the officer's misconduct. Former colleagues, community members, even people who had been at the scene of the slap, they all told the same story. Clive had a history of racism and abuse of power. The pressure on Clive mounted, and he began to feel the weight of his choices crashing down on him. He'd always believed his badge protected him, but now he could feel it slipping away. At home, his wife, Emma, sat quietly across from him at the kitchen table. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt cold and distant. She couldn't look him in the eye as he tried to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. "Emma," he pleaded, his voice shaking, "you know I didn't mean for it to get this far. I lost control. It was a mistake." She shook her head slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "You think slapping a woman in front of a crowd is just a mistake? You've changed, Clive. I don't even recognize you anymore." The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Emma stood up, her face a mixture of sadness and disgust. "I can't be here for this. Not anymore." She left, taking nothing but her purse, and Clive was left alone in the house that once felt like home. Days passed, and the guilt gnawed at him. He was a man who had built his life around a badge, around power, around control. But now that very identity was crumbling. He was no longer the officer people respected. He was the officer who had slapped a woman, and nothing could undo that. In his mind, he replayed the moment again and again, the slap, her defiance, the way the crowd had turned against him. And for the first time, Clive began to question everything. What had he become? Clive's downfall was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling of everything he had built. The choices he made, arrogance, hatred, the belief that power would shield him, had led him down a path he couldn't return from. And as Imani's fight for justice grew louder, Clive was left to reckon with the truth of his actions, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks following his suspension felt like an eternity for Clive. The walls closed in, and the pressure of his actions, the slap, the racial slurs, the abuse of power, piled on him from every angle. The community's outrage was relentless. His name had become synonymous with shame, and every day he faced the consequences of his ignorance. His career was hanging by a thread, and even his own family had turned their backs on him. It was at his lowest point that Clive received a phone call from his lawyer asking him to attend a mediation session with Imani. It was an opportunity for him to make amends, to apologize for what he had done. But even now, as he prepared to meet Imani face to face, Clive wasn't sure he could find the words. What could he say to make up for the years of hatred and prejudice that had fueled his actions? He walked into the mediation room with a sinking feeling, dreading the moment when he would finally have to face Imani. She sat across from him, calm and composed, her eyes focused and unwavering. There was no anger in her gaze, just a quiet strength that seemed to pierce through him. The mediator, a neutral third party, gave them both a moment of silence before speaking. "Clive," the mediator began, "you've been given an opportunity to address the harm you've caused and to begin the process of healing. This is your chance to make things right." Clive opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He could feel his throat tightening, his stomach turning. He wanted to speak, but he didn't know how to begin. Imani, for her part, said nothing. She simply waited, letting the silence hang in the air. waiting for Clive to find the words that would set the stage for accountability. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Clive spoke, his voice breaking. I don't know where to start," he muttered, looking down at his hands. "I was wrong, so wrong. I've spent my life thinking I knew better, thinking my badge gave me the right to treat people however I wanted. But I was blind to the pain I was causing. I let fear and ignorance guide me, and now I see how much harm I've done." Amani's gaze never wavered as she listened. She had heard apologies before, empty words from those who didn't truly understand the weight of their actions. But this time she felt something different in Clive's voice. It wasn't just an apology. It was the beginning of a painful but necessary awakening. "I'm sorry for what I did to you," Clive continued, his voice trembling. "And I'm sorry for all the people I've hurt. I don't expect you to forgive me, not right away, but I want you to know that I've been wrong. I'm ashamed of who I've been." Amani sat still for a moment, processing his words. She had every right to let her anger take over, to demand vengeance. But something about Clive's admission, the vulnerability in his voice, moved her. She had always believed in accountability, but she also believed in the power of change. And she could see that change beginning to take root in Clive. She finally spoke, her voice firm but compassionate. "I won't accept your apology unless you prove it through action, she said, looking him straight in the eye. "Words aren't enough anymore. You have to show the community, and most importantly yourself, that you're committed to learning and changing. This isn't just about saying sorry, it's about being part of the solution." Clive nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. He had never imagined this conversation would be so difficult. But now, with Amani's words ringing in his ears, he knew that he couldn't just walk away from this. He had to do more than apologize. He had to atone for his actions. "I promise," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The days that followed were some of the most difficult of Clive's life, but they were also the beginning of something new. He made the decision to resign from the police force, realizing that he could no longer serve in a system that allowed officers like him to abuse their power. The media coverage of his resignation was extensive, with many seeing it as a sign that, even in the face of adversity, people could change. Clive began attending community events, speaking to groups about the importance of racial equality, educating himself on the history of racial oppression, and sharing his journey of transformation. He knew it would take time, but he was willing to put in the work to start rebuilding the trust he had broken. Amani, meanwhile, continued her fight for justice. Her youth program, which had started as a small idea, began to gain momentum. Donations flooded in, and local organizations offered their support. Amani's vision for a better, more inclusive future was becoming a reality. She stood before a group of young people at a community center, her voice filled with hope. "This is what change looks like," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "This is what happens when we stand up for what's right, when we fight for those who can't fight for themselves. We're not just here to make noise. We're here to make a difference, and it starts with all of you." As the crowd cheered, Amani couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had fought for justice, and though the battle was far from over, she knew she had already made a difference. "It's never too late to learn," she said, her voice steady and determined. "But the fight for justice is far from over. Change is possible. Never stop fighting for what's right."